Humanity has been under observation for years without ever knowing it. Somewhere beyond our world, a far more advanced species has been studying us, waiting for the right moment to act. Ray arrives home late for the weekend handoff with his ex-wife and her new husband. The tension is immediate. She clearly doubts Ray can handle the kids, while Ray is irritated by how much more responsible her husband seems. Their children, teenage Robbie and 10-year-old Rachel, aren't exactly excited to stay with him either. Before leaving for Boston to visit her parents, Ray's pregnant ex-wife notices the messy kitchen, but leaves the kids with him anyway. Soon after, a news report mentions a strange electromagnetic disturbance in Ukraine that caused a massive blackout. Ray barely pays attention. He takes the kids outside and tries to play baseball with Robbie instead. It doesn't go well. Robbie calls him Ray instead of Dad, making their strained relationship obvious. A simple game quickly turns into an argument, and Robbie storms inside. Rachel tries talking to Ray afterward, but he isn't interested. He falls asleep and leaves the kids to arrange dinner themselves because there's almost nothing in the refrigerator. The next morning, Rachel again tries making conversation, but Ray remains distant. Then he realizes Robbie is gone and has taken his car. Ray heads outside looking for him and notices neighbors staring at the sky. A huge, unnatural storm cloud hangs over the area. Ray calls Rachel outside to see it. For a moment, everything becomes strangely quiet. Then lightning strikes. Rachel wants to run inside, but Ray initially watches in amazement. Another bolt hits, then another. The strikes keep landing in exactly the same area, becoming more violent each time. Ray finally grabs Rachel and rushes inside. They hide beneath a table as the house shakes from the thunder. Ray tries calming her by saying lightning doesn't strike the same place twice, but this time it does. The same spot is hit 26 times, then the storm suddenly stops. Rachel is terrified, and Ray soon notices that all the power is gone. His phone is dead. Outside, every vehicle in the neighborhood has stopped working too. Ray finds Robbie and sends him home to stay with Rachel. He then heads toward the area where the lightning struck. On the way, he sees a friend trying to get a dead vehicle running by replacing its battery. Nearby residents gather around the damaged street, guessing that some kind of solar event caused the blackout. Police begin clearing people away. Then the ground starts shaking. Cracks spread across the road as the pavement tears apart. Buildings begin collapsing, and huge sections of the street rise and fall. The crowd realizes this is far more than an earthquake and starts running. Something enormous begins pushing up from underground. Massive metal legs break through the street, followed by a gigantic machine that pulls itself completely out of the earth. Everyone stops in shock. The towering machine rises above the surrounding buildings on 3 enormous legs. It releases a deafening mechanical roar before slowly turning toward the people below. Then its weapons activate. Powerful energy beams sweep across the streets. Anyone they hit is instantly destroyed, leaving behind only ash and empty clothing. Ray runs for his life as the machine attacks everything around him. Buildings explode, people vanish only feet away, and the streets collapse into chaos. Somehow, Ray escapes and makes it back home. The moment he enters the kitchen, he drops to the floor. Robbie and Rachel desperately ask what happened, but he can't answer. His clothes and body are covered in gray powder. It isn't dust, it's what remains of the people who were killed. Ray rushes to wash it off. Once he regains control, he realizes they need to leave immediately. He tells the kids to pack. They bombard him with questions, but Ray doesn't explain. He grabs his gun and gets them out of the house. Outside, the neighborhood has descended into panic. People are running, screaming, and searching for family members, while Ray focuses only on getting his children away. He takes Robbie and Rachel to the vehicle his friend managed to repair with a new battery. With almost every other car disabled, it may be their only way out. Ray puts the kids inside. His friend realizes what Ray is doing and demands the car back. Ray tells him to come with them, but the man hesitates and keeps arguing. Ray knows they can't stay there. He drives away with the children, leaving his friend behind. That delay costs the man his life. Ray speeds onto the highway, trying to put as much distance as possible between them and the city. Rachel finally breaks down. Everything she's seen and heard has overwhelmed her, and she begins panicking. Ray struggles to calm her. Robbie handles it better. He takes his sister's hand and talks her through it until her breathing slowly returns to normal. Once things settle, Ray explains what he believes happened. The giant machine didn't seem to arrive during the storm. It looked like it had already been buried underground for a long time. Ray suspects whatever controls it came down through the lightning and activated it from below. He can't be sure, but he knows they have to keep moving. The highway is nearly empty because almost every vehicle has been disabled. Their working car gives them a rare chance to escape. Eventually, Ray reaches his ex-wife's house. no one is there. She and her husband have already left for Boston. Ray decides driving all the way there immediately is too risky, so they will spend the night in the house and continue toward Boston in the morning. Inside, he looks for food while everyone struggles with exhaustion and fear. The kids complain, Ray loses patience, and another argument begins. At this point, Ray is overwhelmed by everything that has happened. More than anything, he wants to get Robbie and Rachel safely back to their mother and be done with the responsibility he never expected to face. Ray does care about his children, but the crisis is making one thing painfully clear. He has no idea how to protect two terrified kids through something this extreme. They spend the night in the basement, hoping it will offer some protection if the attacks continue. Hours later, another violent storm hits. Lightning flashes outside, and suddenly the whole house starts shaking. Robbie and Rachel wake in panic. Ray pulls them deeper into the basement as the walls tremble around them. Then a massive explosion tears through the neighborhood. The impact rocks the house, but somehow all three survive. They remain underground for the rest of the night, while explosions, crashes, and distant mechanical noises continue above them. When daylight finally comes, Ray cautiously heads upstairs. The neighborhood is almost unrecognizable. A passenger plane has crashed directly into the area, destroying much of the house and scattering wreckage across the surrounding streets. While Ray looks through the devastation, he meets two members of a television news crew. They have discovered more about the machines. People are calling them tripods because each one stands on three enormous legs. Worse, the machine Ray saw wasn't the only one. There are many of them. The military has already tried fighting back, but conventional weapons appear useless. Each tripod is surrounded by an invisible shield that stops bullets and missiles before they can hit it. The reporter then shows Ray footage of the earlier lightning strikes. When the video is slowed down, a small object can be seen moving inside one of the bolts and entering the ground. That gives Ray a possible explanation. The machines may have been buried beneath the earth long before the attack, with their operators arriving through the strange lightning to activate them. Before Ray can learn more, another tripod can be heard approaching. The news crew immediately leaves. Ray returns to the children and tells them they're moving again. Before taking Rachel outside, he tells her not to look around. She obeys. Robbie doesn't. He sees the destroyed homes, the crashed plane, scattered wreckage, and signs of death throughout the neighborhood. Only now does he fully understand how serious the situation has become. They get back into the car and continue toward Boston. Later, both kids need a bathroom break, so Ray stops along a quiet stretch of road. He warns them not to go far. Their working vehicle is now extremely valuable, and Ray knows desperate survivors could easily take it. Rachel wants privacy, so she walks farther away toward the river. Then she notices something in the water. Bodies. They drift past one after another. Rachel stands frozen until Ray realizes where she has gone. He runs toward her, sees what she is staring at, and quickly pulls her away before carrying her back to the car. Once they're moving again, they pass a military convoy traveling toward the attack zone. Robbie watches the soldiers and suddenly wants to join them. He moves toward the roadside, shouting and trying to get their attention. Ray stops him immediately. Robbie becomes furious. To him, constantly running feels cowardly. He wants to fight instead of hiding. Ray refuses to let his teenage son charge toward machines that have already destroyed entire neighborhoods. Robbie accuses him of being scared. Years of resentment come pouring out. He believes Ray has always avoided responsibility, and now he thinks his father is only trying to return them to their mother as quickly as possible. Ray sees things differently. He isn't interested in proving himself. He only wants Robbie and Rachel alive. The argument eventually dies down, but nothing between them is really resolved. After hours on the road, Ray becomes too exhausted to continue driving. He asks Robbie to take the wheel. Robbie is surprised, but the responsibility means something to him. For once, his father is trusting him with something important. They keep moving until they reach a larger city after dark. The streets are packed with stranded people. Almost immediately, everyone notices their car. Very few vehicles still work, which makes theirs incredibly valuable. Ray and Robbie switch seats while the car is still moving. Then people begin surrounding them. Hands slam against the windows. Survivors grab at the doors and beg them to stop. Everyone wants the vehicle. Ray keeps moving until a woman holding a baby suddenly steps directly in front of him. He swerves to avoid her and crashes into a pole. The crowd instantly closes in. Windows are smashed. People reach inside. Robbie is dragged from the vehicle, and Ray is pulled out moments later. Several people attack them while others fight among themselves over the car. Ray struggles toward Robbie and finally pulls out his gun. He fires a warning shot into the air. The crowd backs off just long enough for Robbie to escape. Then another man appears with a gun of his own. He points it directly at Ray and demands the car. Ray knows the vehicle isn't worth dying over. He gives it up, asking only to get Rachel out first. She's still trapped inside while strangers surround the vehicle. Ray reaches her, pulls her free, and gets both children away from the crowd. The three hide inside an abandoned coffee shop. There, Ray finally breaks down. Everything he has seen catches up with him at once. The destruction, the people dying around them, the pressure of keeping Robbie and Rachel alive. For the first time since the attack began, he sits down and cries, but they can't stay there. Eventually, Ray gets moving again. Without the car, they join thousands of refugees traveling on foot. Families carry whatever they manage to save, while survivors trade stories about attacks happening elsewhere. The rumors are getting worse. People claim the tripods aren't limited to one city or even one country. They are appearing across the world. Entire populations are being destroyed wherever they arrive. If those stories are true, there may not be anywhere safe left. Eventually, the crowd reaches a ferry crossing. For a brief moment, everything seems calm. Thousands of people gather near the water, desperate to board the ferry and reach the other side. Then the familiar mechanical roar echoes across the area. A tripod appears. The crowd erupts. Everyone pushes toward the ferry at once. Soldiers block the boarding area, knowing that too many passengers could overload the vessel. But panic has taken over. People shove, scream, and force their way forward. Ray keeps Robbie and Rachel close and somehow gets them through the barricade. They make it onto the ferry just before it leaves. Thousands of people are left behind on the shore. Robbie sees them and moves toward the edge, trying to help someone else climb aboard. Ray notices. For a moment, he sees something different in his son. Robbie isn't only thinking about himself. Then the water begins moving. Something huge is underneath them. A tripod rises directly from the river. Before the passengers can react, it attacks. The ferry tilts hard and begins rolling over. Hundreds of people are thrown into the water. Ray desperately searches for Robbie and Rachel as everyone fights to stay afloat. The tripods are no longer simply using their energy beams. Long mechanical tentacles reach into the water and grab survivors. The captured people are lifted toward the machines instead of being killed immediately. Ray keeps fighting through the chaos, struggling to stay close to both children. Against all odds, Ray, Robbie, and Rachel survive the sinking. Eventually, all three manage to reach the opposite shore. There is still no chance to stop. The tripods are closing in, so Ray, Robbie, and Rachel keep moving until exhaustion finally forces them to spend the night outside with other survivors. By morning, they reach higher ground and discover a massive battle taking place beyond the hill. Military vehicles rush toward the front. Artillery fires nonstop, aircraft tear across the sky, and explosions cover the landscape. The military is hitting the tripods with everything it has. Nothing works. Their shields stop every missile and round before it can touch them, allowing the machines to keep advancing. Robbie watches the battle and becomes completely absorbed by it. Then he starts heading toward the soldiers. Ray immediately follows him with Rachel, yelling for Robbie to come back, but Robbie keeps going. After spending days running and feeling powerless, he finally sees people fighting back. He refuses to turn away. Ray leaves Rachel beside a tree and orders her to stay there while he goes after Robbie. He catches his son and tackles him. This time, Ray isn't arguing with him. He's begging. He tells Robbie that Rachel needs him and admits that he needs him too, but Robbie refuses to stay. He insists on going toward the battle, even though Ray knows he may never come back. Then Rachel starts screaming. A frightened couple has found her standing alone and assumes she has been abandoned. They grab her and begin taking her away. Rachel struggles and keeps shouting that her father is coming back. Ray hears her. Now Robbie is moving toward the battlefield while Rachel is being carried in the opposite direction. Ray cannot reach both of them. He makes one final attempt to stop Robbie, but his son has already made his choice. Ray finally lets him go. He watches Robbie disappear toward the fighting, then turns and runs after Rachel. Ray catches the couple and pulls his daughter back into his arms. Seconds later, a huge explosion erupts where Robbie went. Flames fill the horizon as a tripod pushes through the destruction. Ray can only stare. He has no way of knowing whether Robbie survived, but there is no time to search. Rachel is still with him, and Ray forces himself to keep her moving. Eventually, they find a nearby house where a man offers them shelter in his basement. The stranger carries a shotgun, but compared with what is happening outside, the basement seems safe enough. Ray brings Rachel inside and helps her settle down. She immediately asks about Robbie. Ray tells her that her brother will reach Boston and meet them there. He says it with confidence, even though he has no idea whether it's true. Something inside Ray has changed. Earlier, getting the kids back to their mother felt like a responsibility he simply wanted to finish. Now the thought that Robbie may be dead tears him apart. Ray focuses completely on Rachel. He tells her stories and even awkwardly sings to her until she finally falls asleep. Afterward, Ray talks with the man who owns the house. His name is Harlan. Harlan has lost his family during the invasion, but instead of running, he wants to fight. He believes that even if humanity cannot win, dying while resisting is better than hiding. Ray wants nothing to do with that idea. His only goal is keeping Rachel alive. Their different priorities quickly create tension between them. Then the tripods move directly above the house. The basement shakes as pieces of the ceiling fall. Harlan grabs his shotgun and seems almost excited by the possibility of fighting them. Ray immediately realizes how dangerous that attitude is. Trying to attack the machines would accomplish nothing except reveal their location. Then everything suddenly becomes quiet. A thin mechanical tentacle enters through an opening in the basement. At its tip is a camera-like eye. It slowly scans the room. The tripods are searching for people. Ray and Harlan silently move from one hiding place to another, carefully staying outside its view. Harlan reaches for an axe. Ray stops him. Attacking the probe would only alert the machine above them. Ray notices a mirror nearby and uses it to distract the device. When the mechanical eye turns toward the mirror, it focuses on its own reflection. That gives both men enough time to slip out of sight. After several tense moments, the probe finally retreats. They think the danger has passed. Then they hear movement nearby. Something else is entering the basement. This time it isn't a machine. Aliens themselves come inside. The creatures are thin and strange, moving cautiously through the room while examining human objects with curiosity. Ray and Harlan remain hidden as the aliens wander only a short distance away. For the first time, the invaders are standing in the same room as them. Harlan quietly raises his shotgun. Ray sees what he's about to do. One shot would reveal them instantly. He grabs Harlan, and the two struggle silently over the weapon while the aliens continue exploring nearby. Ray eventually gets control of the gun without drawing their attention. Then the loud horn of a tripod sounds outside. The aliens react and leave the basement. Ray and Harlan have survived again. But the next day reveals something even worse. Through an opening in the house, they watch a tripod capture a man. Instead of killing him immediately, the machine drains blood from his body. That blood is then sprayed across the surrounding area. By now, strange red growth has spread across buildings, trees, roads, and fields. It looks like thick veins covering the landscape. Ray realizes the aliens aren't simply killing humans, they're using them. Whatever is spreading across Earth appears to depend on human blood. The sight pushes Harlan past his breaking point. He begins talking about secret underground armies, resistance tunnels, and survivors hiding beneath the ground until they can launch a counterattack. His thinking becomes increasingly irrational. Then he decides to start digging a tunnel beneath the basement himself. Harlan grabs tools and begins smashing and digging into the walls. Ray desperately tells him to stop. The aliens are still nearby, and all that noise could expose them. Harlan refuses to listen. Ray realizes the man has become a serious threat. If Harlan keeps making noise, Rachel could die because of him. Ray decides he cannot allow that. He takes Rachel away from Harlan and covers her eyes. Then he asks her to sing one of her favorite songs. Rachel doesn't understand why, but she does what he asks. While she sings, Ray enters another room with Harlan and shuts the door. Rachel doesn't see what happens. When Ray returns later, Harlan is gone. Ray is shaken by what he has done, but he believed it was the only way to keep Rachel safe. Rachel stays close to him and quietly comforts him. Eventually, exhaustion takes over and they fall asleep. But the basement is still not safe. The following day, the mechanical probe returns. Its long tentacle slides back into the room and begins searching once again. This time, Ray and Rachel cannot avoid it. The camera-like eye turns toward Rachel and stops. It is looking directly at her. Rachel screams and Ray reacts immediately. He grabs the axe Harlan had wanted to use and swings at the mechanical probe. He strikes it repeatedly until dark red fluid begins spilling from the damaged tentacle. Terrified, Rachel runs upstairs. Ray keeps attacking until the device stops moving. Then he turns and realizes Rachel is gone. He races out of the basement after her. Outside, the land has been transformed. Alien growth covers the hills, and much of the surrounding area looks dead. Ray runs across the open ground, calling Rachel's name. Then he spots a tripod and quickly hides. A moment later, he hears Rachel scream. The machine has found her. One of its tentacles grabs Rachel and lifts her into the air, pulling her toward a compartment inside the tripod. Ray watches helplessly. He already believes Robbie is gone. He refuses to lose Rachel too. Nearby, Ray finds abandoned military equipment and discovers several grenades inside an armored vehicle. He takes them and runs straight toward the tripod. There is no careful plan. He simply needs the machine to notice him. Ray shouts and throws a grenade. The explosion hits the tripod's shield and does no real damage. But it gets the machine's attention. A tentacle reaches toward Ray. Instead of escaping, he lets it grab him. The tripod lifts him into the air and drops him inside a cage filled with captured people. Dozens of terrified prisoners are trapped there. Then Ray sees Rachel. She's alive. He pushes through the crowd toward her, but before he can reach her, a mechanical tube descends into the cage. It grabs one of the prisoners and pulls the screaming man up into the machine. Now Ray understands exactly what the tripods are doing. They're harvesting people for their blood. The tube comes down again. This time, it grabs Ray by the leg. He is dragged upward toward the machine's interior. Ray still has the grenades. As he is pulled higher, one trapped soldier grabs his arm. Another person grabs the soldier. Then more survivors join in. Together, they form a human chain and pull Ray back. The machine nearly takes him, but the prisoners refuse to release him. With one final effort, they drag Ray back into the cage. He falls to the floor. The grenades, however, are gone. Ray left them inside the tripod. Everyone realizes what is about to happen. Seconds later, the grenades explode. Because the blast happens inside the machine's shield, the tripod has no protection from it. The explosion tears through its interior. The machine loses balance and crashes to the ground. Its cage breaks apart, allowing the surviving prisoners to escape. Ray finds Rachel and gets her away from the wreckage. They continue toward Boston. As they travel, Ray notices that the alien vegetation covering everything is changing. The red growth is starting to wither. The vines are drying out and collapsing. Then they come across a tripod lying motionless against a building. There are no signs of a battle, no major damage. The machine simply appears to have stopped functioning. Ray doesn't know why, but something is clearly happening to the invaders. For the first time, they no longer seem unstoppable. Later, another tripod moves through the city. People begin running for cover. Ray looks up and notices birds landing directly on the machine. That immediately catches his attention. Earlier, the tripod's shields prevented anything from touching them. If birds can land on this one, its shield must be down. Ray starts shouting to nearby soldiers and points toward the birds. They understand what he's telling them. The military redirects its weapons toward the tripod, while civilians rush into an underground passage. Then the soldiers fire. This time, the rounds go straight through. There is no invisible barrier. Shells strike the tripod directly. Its upper section explodes, and the machine begins to lose balance. Moments later, it crashes into the street. People slowly come out of hiding and gather around the fallen machine. For the first time, one of the tripods has been brought down by human weapons. Then red liquid begins pouring from its damaged interior. An alien limb hangs from an opening. It moves weakly before becoming still. The creature itself slowly appears. It looks sick and exhausted. It makes one final sound before collapsing. Ray still doesn't know what is killing them, but the invasion is clearly breaking down. He and Rachel continue through Boston until they finally reach her grandparents' house. Ray approaches cautiously, unsure of what they will find. The door opens. Rachel's mother appears. For a moment, she can only stare. Then she sees Rachel. Rachel runs into her arms, and her mother holds her tightly. She looks back at Ray. The distrust she once had for him is gone. He managed to bring their daughter all the way to Boston alive. Then someone else appears at the house. Ray looks up. It's Robbie. Against all odds, he survived the battle and somehow made it to Boston. Ray can barely believe it. He walks toward his son and pulls him into an embrace. After everything between them, Robbie is alive. And this time, he calls Ray Dad. The invasion's collapse is eventually explained. Human weapons were not what defeated the aliens. Their technology was far more advanced, and their shields could withstand everything the military threw at them. But the invaders had failed to prepare for something much smaller, the microorganisms already living on Earth. Humans had existed alongside these microscopic organisms for countless generations and developed defenses against many of them. The aliens had not. Once exposed to Earth's environment, they became sick. Their bodies weakened. Their machines began failing. And eventually, the invasion collapsed. Humanity survived because the invaders could conquer armies and cities, but they could not survive the The interesting thing about Spielberg's War of the Worlds is that it never really feels interested in simply remaking the 1953 movie scene for scene. It takes the basic idea, keeps the invasion, keeps that feeling of humanity suddenly becoming completely powerless, and then rebuilds almost everything around a much more ordinary kind of character. And I think that choice matters. The 1953 version approached the material in a way that made sense for its time. Spielberg, though, had a completely different set of tools available to him. Bigger budget, modern effects, far fewer technical limitations. He could show destruction on a scale that earlier filmmakers simply couldn't. So there was always going to be this expectation that his version would somehow become the definitive cinematic war of the worlds. Whether it actually does that is where things get complicated. Instead of putting scientists, military leaders, or some traditionally heroic figure at the center of the story, Spielberg gives us Ray Ferrier, a divorced dockworker who isn't particularly impressive when we first meet him. He isn't preparing for an invasion. He doesn't understand what is happening before everybody else. He doesn't have access to secret information or some plan to save humanity. He's basically just a guy trying to survive long enough to get his children somewhere safe. That immediately changes the scale of the story. The invasion itself may be enormous, but the movie keeps dragging our attention back down to ground level. We aren't sitting in government briefing rooms, watching generals move markers around a map. We aren't constantly cutting to the Pentagon or getting a global explanation of what the aliens are doing. Most of the time, Ray knows about as much as the audience does, which is almost nothing. And that's one of the smarter changes Spielberg makes. You don't really experience this as a war in the conventional blockbuster sense. You experience it as a disaster happening to people who have no idea what the rules are. There's something unnerving about that. Ray sees one machine rise from beneath the street, and only later starts realizing this isn't some isolated event. Information comes in fragments, people talk, cameras capture pieces of what is happening, rumors spread, nobody seems to have the full picture. The movie isn't interested in making Ray important to the invasion. He's important only to his children. That feels much closer to the kind of vulnerability the story needs. At the same time, Spielberg makes some changes that are much harder to defend. The biggest one is probably the idea that the alien machines have been buried underground for an incredibly long time, apparently waiting for the invasion to begin. It gives the first tripod emergence a fantastic visual payoff, but the more you think about the idea itself, the stranger it becomes. Why were the machines placed there so far in advance? How long exactly have they been there? Why build the invasion around this complicated setup? The film doesn't really make those questions satisfying. And that's where this version becomes frustrating, because some of its adaptation choices feel very deliberate and useful, while others feel like changes made mainly because Spielberg didn't want to repeat what had already been done. Being different isn't automatically the same thing as being better. The same tension exists when you compare this movie with the 1953 film. There are viewers who understandably prefer the older version. It has its own atmosphere, its own visual identity, and for some people, the simplicity of that film works better than all the extra family drama Spielberg introduces here. Others will probably find the 2005 version much more immediate because the technology finally allows the invasion to feel enormous. You can actually watch roads split apart. You can see these massive machines towering over neighborhoods. Cars are thrown around, buildings disappear, entire crowds are suddenly reduced to panic. The scale is completely different. And yet Spielberg doesn't use that scale to turn the movie into a military spectacle. That's important. A director with this budget could very easily have made a movie about armies fighting aliens for 2 hours. Instead, the military mostly exists somewhere outside Ray's understanding of events. Humanity is clearly fighting back, but that isn't really our story. Our story is a father trying to move his children from one place to another without getting killed. That sounds almost ridiculously small compared with the destruction happening around them, but that's exactly why the approach can work. The movie also has a nice connection to the 1953 adaptation through the appearances of Gene Barry and Anne Robinson. It's a small gesture, almost like Spielberg acknowledging the movie that came before his without allowing it to dictate what his version has to be, because this really is a different interpretation. Even calling it a remake doesn't completely describe what Spielberg is doing. The basic DNA comes from H.G. Wells, obviously, and the 1953 film hangs over any later adaptation, whether the filmmakers want it to or not. But Spielberg is trying to translate the idea of War of the Worlds into a contemporary American nightmare. The original setting is gone. The social environment is different. The protagonist is different. The family dynamic becomes much more important. Even the way information travels during the invasion feels modern. People are watching through cameras, trying to understand fragments of something that is much bigger than any individual person can process. That gives the film a strange immediacy. You aren't watching humanity organize itself against an enemy. You're watching ordinary people realize, minute by minute, that everything they thought was permanent may already be collapsing. And Spielberg is very good at that part. Where the adaptation becomes more debatable is when the intimate family story starts competing with the science fiction material instead of supporting it. Some viewers will find Ray's relationship with his children to be exactly what the movie needs. Others will wonder why, during the possible extermination of humanity, we're spending so much time dealing with a rebellious teenager and an emotionally broken household. Both reactions make sense because Spielberg clearly wants the invasion to be enormous and personal at the same time. Sometimes those two things reinforce each other. Sometimes they absolutely don't. But I do think choosing Ray as the center of the story was the right idea. Making him ordinary gives the invasion weight. He can't defeat the aliens. He can't even properly explain them. Half the time he can barely keep his own family together. All he can do is keep moving. And for a story about humanity suddenly discovering how small it really is, that may be a much more fitting perspective than another scientist standing in front of a screen explaining the end of the world. What makes Ray Ferrier interesting is that the movie doesn't introduce him as somebody you'd naturally trust in a crisis. He's not especially responsible. He's not close to his kids. He's divorced, living his own life, and when Robbie and Rachel are dropped off with him, you immediately get the sense that this is a father who has somehow managed to remain slightly outside his own family. The kids know it too. There is already tension before anything happens. Robbie doesn't respect him much. Rachel isn't completely comfortable around him. Ray himself seems more annoyed by the responsibility than prepared for it. The family dynamic isn't warm, and Spielberg doesn't spend much time pretending otherwise. Then the world starts ending, and suddenly all those small domestic problems are trapped inside something enormous. That's really the gamble the movie takes. Instead of making War of the Worlds primarily about humanity fighting back, it makes the invasion a pressure test for this already damaged family. Ray isn't trying to save the planet. Most of the time, he barely knows what is happening outside the few miles around him. His entire objective becomes much simpler: keep these two kids alive and get them back to their mother. It's not glamorous heroism. Actually, Ray spends a lot of the movie frightened, confused, dirty, exhausted, and improvising badly. That works for the character because he's not suddenly transformed into some perfect action movie, Father the second the tripods appear. He's still Ray, he still struggles to communicate, he still makes mistakes, he still has no grand plan, but something does change. Before the invasion, responsibility feels optional to him. After it begins, responsibility becomes pretty much the only thing he has left. You see that most clearly with Rachel. There's a physical side to protecting her, obviously. Ray has to move her out of danger, hide her, carry her, keep her close when everything around them is collapsing. But Spielberg keeps returning to another part of parenting that I think is more interesting. Ray trying to protect her from what she is seeing. The world around Rachel becomes increasingly horrific. Bodies in the water, people attacking one another, entire communities disappearing, things no child should have to process. And Ray keeps trying, sometimes desperately, to block that reality from reaching her. He covers her eyes. He tries to distract her. He tells her not to look. Even when he's clearly terrified himself, there is this growing instinct to absorb as much of the horror as possible before it reaches his daughter. There's a small moment later where he sings Little Deuce Coupe to her so she can calm down enough to sleep. Nothing explodes. No tripod appears. There's no giant effects sequence. It's just a father who has run out of useful answers, trying to give his daughter something familiar for a few minutes. And for me, those quieter moments explain what the movie is trying to do with Ray better than any big speech could. Robbie is more complicated. His relationship with Ray is angry almost from the beginning, and that anger doesn't magically disappear when the invasion starts. If anything, it gets worse. Robbie keeps challenging him, refusing to listen, pushing against his authority at exactly the moments when Ray needs control the most. Now, this is where the family story starts dividing people. Because depending on how you respond to Robbie, those scenes either feel like believable conflict between an estranged father and a teenage son, or unbelievably irritating behavior during the literal collapse of civilization. And I get both reactions. There are moments where Robbie's rebellion feels connected to years of resentment. Ray hasn't earned automatic trust from him. You can't be emotionally absent for years and then expect your son to immediately treat you like the unquestioned leader just because things have gone bad. But there are also moments where Robbie's decisions become so reckless that the character starts feeling like a device designed to create conflict. That's where the family material can become frustrating. The film wants these people to feel messy and unresolved, which is fair. Real families don't become emotionally healthy because aliens appear. But the movie is also moving through situations where survival depends on people making basic decisions together, and sometimes the constant fighting starts competing with the tension rather than strengthening it. That question hangs over the entire family storyline. Does focusing on Ray, Robbie, and Rachel make the invasion more human, or does it make the invasion feel smaller than it should? Because there are scenes where humanity is apparently being wiped out, and we're still dealing with arguments about Ray being a bad father. Some viewers are going to hate that. They'll want the movie to open up, show more of the world, give us the military response, explain what's happening elsewhere. Spielberg keeps refusing to do that. He keeps dragging us back to this family. And I think the reason is pretty simple. For Ray, this is the end of the world, but it's also the first time he's being forced to fully act like a father. The invasion doesn't create a new man out of nowhere. It reveals what he's capable of when he no longer has the option of walking away. That's why his arc isn't really about becoming brave. He's brave because he has to be. It's about becoming responsible. There's a difference. He starts the movie as a man who doesn't really know his own children. He doesn't understand what Rachel needs. He can't control Robbie. He seems surprised by how disconnected they are from him. Then everything familiar disappears. No normal home, no normal transportation, no reliable authority, no guarantee that tomorrow even exists. And all of a sudden those relationships are the only things left that matter. The irony is that Ray becomes more connected to his children at exactly the moment the rest of civilization is being torn apart. That's a very Spielberg idea, maybe too Spielberg for some people, but it does give the movie an emotional shape beyond just running from one attack to another. The family is broken before the aliens arrive. The aliens don't fix them. That's important. They force them into situations where all the distance, resentment, fear, and responsibility can no longer be ignored. And Ray's transformation is gradual enough that you can still see the old version of him underneath everything. He's still clumsy, still scared, still occasionally selfish. He doesn't suddenly become wise. But now when something goes wrong, his first thought increasingly becomes Rachel and Robbie. That's the growth. And honestly, I prefer that to making him some naturally heroic father from the beginning. If Ray had already been responsible, loving, emotionally available, and completely devoted to his kids, there wouldn't be much of a character journey here. The movie needs him to be a failure before it can ask whether catastrophe can change him. The larger thematic idea is pretty obvious once you notice it. The invasion changes perspective. Things Ray probably thought were important before suddenly mean nothing. Pride means nothing. Old arguments mean nothing. Whatever resentment exists between him and his ex-wife means nothing when he is standing in a world where entire groups of people can disappear in seconds. Survival strips everything down, and what remains for Ray is basically one question: can he keep his children alive? That's why I don't think the family story is just a random subplot attached to the Alien movie. At its best, it's the reason the Alien movie has any emotional weight at all, but it does come with a cost. The more Spielberg insists that the farriers are the center of everything, the more patience the audience needs to have with these characters. If Robbie annoys you, if Rachel's panic gets on your nerves, or if Ray never becomes someone you care about, then huge sections of the movie are going to feel like interruptions between the tripods. If the family works for you, though, the whole film changes. The destruction isn't just impressive anymore. It becomes something happening to people whose relationships are still unfinished. And that's probably the most uncomfortable thing about Ray's story. He doesn't get time to slowly become a better father under normal circumstances. He gets the end of the world. That's his opportunity. And somehow, in the middle of all that destruction, he finally starts becoming the parent he should have been before any of it happened. The performances in War of the Worlds are probably one of the biggest reasons people come away from the movie with completely different reactions. Tom Cruise is the obvious place to start, because almost everything depends on whether you buy him as Ray Ferrier. For me, he works, not because Ray is especially likable. He isn't. That's actually part of the point. Cruise plays him as a guy who is slightly disconnected from his own life, especially when it comes to being a father. He's confident in the way he carries himself, but emotionally, he's kind of a mess. Then the invasion starts, and Cruise has to shift without making Ray suddenly feel like a different person. That's where the performance gets better. He doesn't become this clean, heroic action figure who instantly understands what to do. A lot of the time, he looks genuinely overwhelmed. He's scared, angry, exhausted, sometimes almost panicking, but he keeps moving because there isn't really another option. And Cruise is naturally good at physical urgency. That's not exactly a surprise. When Ray is running through destruction, pushing through crowds, dragging his kids out of danger, or reacting to something enormous happening just behind him, Cruise sells the speed of those moments really well. But I actually think some of his quieter scenes are more important. The little moment where Ray tries to calm Rachel by singing Little Deuce Coupe is a good example. There's nothing flashy about it. He's just trying to give his daughter something familiar when everything around her has become completely terrifying. It's awkward. It isn't some beautifully composed father-daughter speech, and that's why it works. Ray doesn't suddenly know the perfect thing to say. He just reaches for whatever he has. There are also moments later, especially during the basement section, where Cruz looks like a man trying very hard not to completely lose control of himself because his daughter is right there watching him. That side of the performance is easy to overlook because this is such a large effects movie. A few of the reviews even argue that Cruz is better here than people usually give him credit for, and I can understand why. Ray requires him to be physical without being invincible, emotional without becoming sentimental in every scene, and selfish enough at the beginning that there is somewhere for the character to go. Not everyone bought it, obviously. Some viewers found Cruz lacking in charisma here, which is interesting because charisma is normally the last thing people complain about with him. Others simply didn't connect with Ray enough for the performance to matter. That's fair. If you dislike the character from the opening scenes, Cruz has a difficult job winning you back. Dakota Fanning is probably even more divisive. There are people who think she's excellent in this movie, and there are people who seem genuinely exhausted by Rachel about 20 minutes in. The screaming is the big issue. Rachel screams a lot, and I mean a lot, depending on how you respond to it, that either feels completely believable for a child watching the world collapse around her, or it starts becoming one of those things you notice every single time it happens. I think the stronger side of Fanning's performance comes from the smaller behavior. Rachel feels like a child rather than a tiny adult written to deliver clever dialogue. She becomes scared in messy ways. She asks questions at the wrong moments. She clings to familiar objects. She watches Ray constantly because she needs to know whether he understands what's happening. Most of the time, he doesn't, and Fanning is good at showing that Rachel knows when her father is pretending to have control. That's an interesting dynamic between them. She isn't simply looking at Ray as some perfect protector. There is still uncertainty there. Some reviewers go as far as saying she almost steals scenes from Cruz, especially during the moments of panic and fear. Others find the performance hysterical and irritating. I don't think there's really a way around that split. Rachel is written to be frightened for a huge amount of the movie, so if that particular kind of child performance bothers you, she's going to test your patience. Justin Chatwin has a much tougher situation with Robbie. This is the character almost everybody seems to have an opinion about, and usually not a positive one. Robbie is angry before the invasion even begins. He resents Ray. He doesn't respect him. He challenges him constantly, and once everything starts falling apart, that rebellious streak doesn't disappear. In theory, that's actually interesting. Why should years of resentment disappear just because aliens have arrived? Ray hasn't earned Robbie's trust. He hasn't been the father Robbie wanted him to be. So when Ray suddenly starts giving orders, Robbie doesn't automatically accept him as the authority figure. That part makes sense. The problem is that Robbie's behavior sometimes goes beyond believable teenage anger and starts feeling like the screenplay needs him to make the worst possible decision so another conflict can happen. There are moments where you're not thinking, this kid is angry with his father. You're thinking, why would anyone do this right now? And once an audience reaches that point with a character, it's difficult to recover. One of the reviews is especially harsh about him, but even the more positive reactions tend to admit that Robbie can be frustrating. His relationship with Ray does produce some strong material, though. The confrontation between father and son on the hillside is one of those scenes where the family conflict and the larger disaster finally feel like they're pulling in the same direction. Ray is trying to hold on to his son, while Robbie is being drawn towards something Ray knows he can't control. There's anger in it, but there's also fear underneath. That's probably the version of Robbie the movie needed a little more often. Then there's Tim Robbins. He arrives relatively late, and the movie immediately changes texture. Harlan Ogilvy isn't exactly comforting company. He's nervous, intense, paranoid, and clearly becoming less stable the longer Ray stays around him. Robbins gives the character this strange mixture of usefulness and danger. At first, you can understand why Ray accepts his shelter. Then gradually, you realize that hiding from the aliens may not be the only problem anymore. Some reviewers think Robbins is fantastic, others think he's wasted. And again, both reactions probably come from what you think of the basement section itself. If you like that stretch of the movie, Robbins becomes a major reason it works. His nervous energy turns an already claustrophobic situation into something unpredictable. Ray isn't simply hiding from an alien threat. He's sharing a confined space with someone whose mental state is deteriorating. If you think the basement kills the movie's pacing, then Robbins can feel like the character who arrives and brings the entire film to a stop. Personally, I think his presence gives Cruz something different to play against. Before Ogilvy appears, Ray's problems are mostly external. Keep moving, avoid the tripods, protect the kids. In the basement, everything gets closer, quieter, more psychological. And Robbins makes that discomfort believable because you never completely know what Harlan is going to do next. It's a short performance, but it leaves a mark. What's interesting is that all four of these actors are tied directly to the movie's biggest argument. Do you care about these people enough for the quieter scenes to work? Because Spielberg gives them a lot of space. He doesn't just move from one destruction sequence to another. He asks you to spend time with Ray's guilt, Rachel's fear, Robbie's anger, and Ogilvy's paranoia. If those performances work for you, the alien invasion becomes much more personal. If they don't, you're probably going to start wondering when the tripods are coming back. Cruz carries most of that burden, and I think he handles it better than the film's reputation sometimes suggests. Fanning gives the movie a very raw version of childhood fear, even if the screaming is going to drive some viewers crazy. Chatwin has the hardest job because Robbie is written in a way that often pushes frustration too far. And Robbins comes in late, completely changes the mood, and somehow manages to feel like he belongs in a different movie and this movie at the same time. Messy, yeah, a little. But the performances are also part of what stops War of the Worlds from being just a giant effects reel. For better or worse, Spielberg keeps putting human faces in front of the destruction. And whether you care about those faces probably decides how much of the movie works for you. The first act is where War of the Worlds really reminds you what Spielberg can do when he's in complete control of suspense. He doesn't rush the invasion. That matters. The movie spends a little time letting Ray's ordinary life breathe before everything goes wrong. You get the awkward family setup, the tension with the kids, the sense that this is already a household with problems. Then the weather changes, the lightning starts, power goes out, cars stop working, people gather outside because nobody understands what they're looking at yet, and Spielberg lets that uncertainty sit there for a while. He doesn't immediately cut to a giant alien machine. There's build-up. People are staring at the ground. The street begins to crack. Something underneath is moving. Everybody is confused more than scared at first, which actually makes the scene more effective because the fear arrives in stages. Then the tripod comes up. That whole sequence is probably the movie at its best. The scale is huge, but Spielberg keeps the camera close enough to Ray and the crowd that it still feels personal. You're not watching destruction from some clean aerial view. You're stuck on the street with everyone else, trying to understand what this thing is and what it's about to do. The siren helps too. It gives the machine a presence before it even starts attacking. There's something mechanical and unnatural about it, and Spielberg knows exactly how long to hold on that moment before things turn violent. Once the attack begins, the scene becomes chaos very quickly. People run, buildings come apart, bodies disappear. Ray is trying to escape while everything around him is being destroyed, and the reason it works isn't just the CGI. A weaker director could have had the same effects budget and still made the scene feel like noise. Spielberg understands where to put the camera, when to move it, when to stay with Ray, and when to let the destruction happen in the background, rather than constantly shoving it into the center of the frame. There's always something happening just slightly outside your attention. That makes the whole thing feel less controlled, more dangerous. The movie does this a lot in the early sections. You're usually learning information at the same time Ray does. That restricted point of view is one of the smartest choices in the film. We don't get constant updates about what the government is doing. There aren't endless scenes of military leaders explaining the situation. Nobody sits down and gives Ray a clean summary of the invasion. He finds things out in pieces. At one point, he realizes there are more machines through people with cameras and news equipment. Other information comes from rumors, random conversations, brief glimpses of what's happening elsewhere. It keeps the invasion feeling bigger than the movie can show. That's important. The less Ray understands, the less secure the audience feels. You never really know how far this thing has spread. You don't know if there's anywhere safe. You don't know if somebody is actually in control somewhere else. And Spielberg resists giving you that comfort. There's also this interesting use of cameras inside the movie itself. During the first attack, somebody is filming what's happening, and for a moment, the perspective shifts through that camera as people are being destroyed. It's a strange little detail, but it says a lot about how Spielberg is presenting the violence. We see some of the catastrophe as images being recorded, but the really personal horror stays with Ray and his family. That becomes even clearer with Rachel. Ray keeps trying to control what she sees. When there are bodies in the river, he tries to shield her. When things become brutal later in the basement, again, he tries to stop her from seeing what's happening. He can't protect her from the invasion, obviously, but he can still try to protect some part of her childhood, and Spielberg often puts the audience in a similar position. He shows enough to make the horror clear, but he doesn't always linger on every violent detail. Sometimes what Ray sees is worse than what Rachel sees. Sometimes what we imagine is worse than what the camera directly shows. That's classic suspense filmmaking, really, not because Spielberg hides everything, but because he understands that showing less at the right moment can be more effective than showing everything. The first half is full of that kind of control. The burning train is a perfect example. You don't need a long explanation. You see this train completely engulfed in fire still moving through the night, and that image tells you more about the scale of what's happening than a news report ever could. Same with the bodies in the river. Same with the crowds trying to escape. Same with the car being surrounded by desperate people. The world is collapsing, but Spielberg rarely stops the movie to explain that the world is collapsing. He just keeps showing Ray pieces of it. That makes the invasion feel strangely believable, not realistic in a literal sense, obviously. Giant alien tripods are still giant alien tripods. But the way people react feels recognizable. Confusion first, then disbelief, then panic, then survival takes over. Spielberg is very good at that progression. Some of the reviews compare the suspense here to Jaws and Jurassic Park, and I can see why. Not because the movies are doing exactly the same thing, but because Spielberg keeps using anticipation as part of the spectacle. The event itself is never the whole scene. The build-up is part of the entertainment. Think about the first tripod appearance again. The lightning is important. The dead electronics are important. The crowd gathering is important. The cracking street is important. If Spielberg had simply opened with a tripod blasting people, the scene would still be impressive, but it wouldn't have the same tension. He makes you wait for the impossible thing to happen. Then he makes you wait another few seconds to see what it wants, and then everything goes bad. That pacing is why the first act feels so strong. There's confidence in it. Spielberg knows the audience wants to see the machines, but he doesn't behave like he's afraid we'll get bored if he holds them back for a few minutes. That patience pays off. It's also why the later pacing problems become more noticeable. When the movie is moving through the early invasion, every scene seems to add a new layer of danger. The tripods appear, Ray escapes, the family leaves. The roads become unsafe, crowds become dangerous, the threat keeps changing. Later, when the film becomes more enclosed and slower, some viewers feel like that momentum disappears. But even if you have problems with the second half, the first act is difficult to dismiss. Spielberg is operating on instinct there. Camera placement, sound, movement, crowd behavior, timing. He makes a huge studio production feel surprisingly immediate. And maybe the biggest compliment I can give those early scenes is that they don't feel like the movie is showing off. The effects are enormous. The production is enormous. But Ray is still the center of the frame. He's just one terrified guy running through a disaster he doesn't understand. That's why the first act works so well. Spielberg could have shown us the whole war. Instead, he shows us one man looking up at something impossible and realizing, along with everyone around him, that whatever normal life existed 5 minutes ago is already gone. If there's one thing War of the Worlds gets almost impossible to argue against, it's the sheer presence of the tripods. They don't just look big, they feel big. There's a difference. A lot of effects-heavy movies can put something enormous on screen and still make it feel strangely weightless. Spielberg avoids that. The tripods seem to occupy real space. They tower over streets, buildings, crowds, vehicles. When they move, you get the sense that everything around them has suddenly become too small. That's probably why the first emergence works so well. You've already had the lightning, the power failures, the confusion, the ground beginning to crack. Then this thing starts rising out of the street, and for a few seconds, people don't even know whether to run. They just stare. Honestly, that reaction helps sell the machine as much as the CGI does. The tripod is not introduced like a monster jumping into frame. It arrives almost like an impossible piece of architecture coming to life. Then you hear that sound, that siren, and suddenly the entire mood changes. The sound design in this movie deserves more credit than it usually gets because the tripods would not be nearly as frightening without it. That mechanical call is simple, but it gives them personality without actually making them emotional. You hear it and you know something bad is coming. It's almost like the machines are announcing themselves, not because they need to, just because they can. And once they start attacking, the film really opens up. Roads crack. Cars are thrown around. Bridges and overpasses collapse. Buildings disappear. People are reduced to dust. Whole areas that felt completely ordinary a few minutes earlier become unrecognizable. The scale keeps increasing, but Spielberg is careful not to turn it into some distant destruction montage. He keeps placing Ray inside the damage. That makes a huge difference. You're not sitting above the city watching digital buildings fall over. You're running through it. There's debris behind him. People are screaming beside him. Things are collapsing just outside the frame. Sometimes the camera barely seems interested in showing you the full destruction because Ray is more concerned with surviving it. That gives the effects weight. They're not there just so the movie can say, "Look how much money we spent." They create pressure. And for a 2005 movie, a lot of this stuff still holds up surprisingly well. Some of the CGI is obviously easier to notice now than it would have been at the time, but the overall integration is strong enough that the spectacle rarely pulls you completely out of the movie. The tripods in particular still work because the design is simple enough to feel strange without becoming overloaded. Long legs, huge bodies, a shape that almost feels familiar, but not enough to make it comfortable. They look mechanical, but there's something slightly organic about the way they move. That combination helps. What makes them scary isn't just that they can destroy things, it's that nothing humanity throws at them seems to matter. Weapons don't seem useful. Military hardware doesn't seem useful. People run because fighting them feels pointless. That sense of technological helplessness is one of the most effective things about the movie. The tripods aren't scary because they're fast. They're scary because they don't need to be. They can just keep moving, and everything in front of them disappears. There's a scene with an overpass being destroyed, cars flying and exploding, and it's exactly the kind of image that could become generic blockbuster noise. But Spielberg gives it texture. You see the destruction happening at human level. You feel how quickly a normal route out of danger turns into another trap. Same thing with the ferry material. Same thing with the towns being torn apart. Same thing with the burning train. The movie is constantly finding ways to show us that familiar systems no longer mean anything. Roads don't guarantee escape. Cars don't guarantee escape. A ferry doesn't guarantee escape. Even being around thousands of other people doesn't make you safer. Actually, sometimes it makes things worse, and all of that is supported by the technical side of the movie. The cinematography gives the destruction this dirty, almost washed-out atmosphere at times. It doesn't feel glossy in the way some giant summer blockbusters do. There's a roughness to the images: smoke, dust, shadows, flashes of light. Crowds moving in different directions. The movie often looks chaotic, but not accidentally chaotic. There's control underneath it. The lighting is especially effective when the film moves into darker spaces or nighttime sequences. The alien machinery becomes less defined, which usually makes it more threatening. You see parts of it, a silhouette, a light, a movement. Then the sound finishes the job, and that's where John Williams comes in too. His score isn't constantly demanding attention, which I think helps. There are moments where it becomes more forceful and dramatic, but there's also this unsettling quality underneath some of the invasion material. It doesn't make the tripods feel heroic or adventurous. It makes them feel wrong. The music, the sound effects, the sirens, the explosions, the screaming, the mechanical movement, all of it keeps the movie from becoming purely visual spectacle. You could watch some of these sequences muted and still understand what's happening, but you'd lose half the impact. One of the reviews specifically mentioned how much better the movie plays with a proper surround setup, and that makes sense. The audio isn't just sitting in the background, it surrounds the scene. The lightning strikes early on are a good example. Before the aliens have even fully appeared, the sound is already telling you that something enormous is happening. You hear the threat before you understand it. That's effective. The same goes for the tripod siren. You can almost imagine hearing it from several streets away and knowing you need to move before you even see the machine. The production design also deserves attention because the movie has to destroy a lot of ordinary environments without making them all feel like the same digital battlefield. You get neighborhoods, roads, urban spaces, abandoned areas, crowded escape routes, later, more ruined landscapes. The world gradually looks less inhabited and more defeated. That progression helps the invasion feel larger than the specific scenes we actually witness. You don't need a map showing how much territory has been lost. The environments tell you, and I think that's where the craftsmanship works best. The effects are impressive, yes, but they're part of a larger system: editing, camera movement. Sound, lighting, production design, music, performance, they all have to cooperate. If one of those things feels wrong, a giant tripod can start looking like a very expensive cartoon. Most of the time here it doesn't. That doesn't mean every visual choice works equally well. The actual aliens themselves are a different conversation, and some viewers found their design much less convincing than the machines. I agree that the tripods are more interesting. The machines have mystery. The aliens, once seen more directly, lose some of it. But the equipment, the scouting devices, the war machines, that's where the movie has its strongest visual identity. There are also people who still prefer the look and atmosphere of the 1953 version, and I don't think modern technology automatically settles that argument. More expensive effects do not automatically create better science fiction. Sometimes older limitations force filmmakers to suggest more. Sometimes practical work has a texture CGI struggles to reproduce. So I can understand someone watching Spielberg's version and saying, yes, technically this is more advanced, but I still prefer the older movie. That's completely reasonable. What Spielberg's version does have is scale, real scale. The kind that lets you understand why people in this world stop thinking about victory and start thinking only about escape. The machines don't feel like an enemy waiting for humanity to discover a weakness. They feel like a natural disaster with legs. You move or you die. That's the basic equation. And Spielberg keeps returning to that idea through the craft of the movie. The camera rarely celebrates the destruction. It reacts to it. The sound doesn't make it exciting in some clean, triumphant way. It makes it overwhelming. The visual effects don't give Ray power. They make him look smaller. That's probably the biggest reason the spectacle works. For all the money on screen, the movie never really lets the human characters feel powerful inside it. They're surrounded by technology they don't understand, machines they can't stop, and destruction they can barely outrun. And when one of those tripods rises above a neighborhood and lets out that sound, you understand the situation immediately. Humanity is not in control anymore. A lot of movies can destroy a city. Very few can give you one image that sticks in your head years later. War of the Worlds has several. The first tripod rising out of the ground is the obvious one, and for good reason. Spielberg takes his time with it. The street cracks open, people gather around because they still think they're watching some strange accident, and then this enormous machine slowly pulls itself into view. Nobody knows what it is. Nobody knows what it wants. For a few seconds, even the crowd doesn't run. They just stare. That little delay is what makes the scene work. Curiosity is still stronger than fear because nobody has enough information yet. Then the machine makes that sound. And everything changes. The first attack is brutal because there's no real fight. People aren't battling the tripod. They're just trying to get away from something that can erase them before they understand what's happening. Ray runs through streets while destruction tears through everything behind him, and Spielberg keeps the sequence moving so fast that there's almost no time to process individual deaths. One moment there's a crowd. The next moment there isn't. That's probably more disturbing than if the movie stopped to show everything in detail, and the imagery gets stranger from there. The burning train is one of my favorite examples. It comes out of nowhere. Ray and the others are already trying to make sense of a world that has basically stopped functioning, and then this train comes roaring past, completely consumed by fire. No explanation, no long shot establishing where it came from. It just passes through the frame like something from a nightmare. I love that scene because it tells you how bad things have become without anyone saying a word. Somewhere outside Ray's immediate story, something terrible happened to that train. We don't know exactly what. We don't need to. The fact that it is still moving somehow makes it worse. That's something Spielberg does really well throughout the film. The movie keeps giving you fragments of a larger disaster. You rarely get the complete picture. You get evidence, an empty road, abandoned vehicles, a crowd suddenly running, a machine appearing in the distance, bodies in the water. That river scene is another one that stays with you. Rachel notices something floating by, then another, and slowly it becomes clear what she's actually looking at. Bodies, not one or two, enough that the image completely changes the atmosphere of the scene. Ray immediately tries to stop her from looking, which makes it even more effective because now the horror is happening on two levels. There's the image itself, and there's a father realizing his daughter has just seen something he can't take back. That kind of moment is much more disturbing to me than a giant explosion. It's quiet, there's no heroic response. Nobody can fix it. The dead just keep moving with the water. The ferry sequence works differently. That one is about scale and desperation. People are trying to cross because they believe reaching the other side means safety. That's how humans think in a crisis. Just get over there, get on that boat, reach that road. Find the next place. There's always supposed to be somewhere safer. Spielberg keeps taking that idea away. The crowd reaches the ferry, but the tripods are still there. The machines don't care about geography. They don't care that these people have spent hours trying to escape. Suddenly, what looked like the way out becomes another trap. And because the scene is filled with civilians rather than soldiers, the panic feels uglier. Nobody has a plan. Parents are holding children. People are pushing. Everybody is trying to move at once. The destruction is huge, but the thing that makes the scene uncomfortable is the crowd behavior around it. You can feel how quickly survival turns people into obstacles for one another. That idea becomes even more obvious during the car sequence. Ray has one of the few vehicles that still works, which sounds like an advantage until everyone else realizes it. Then the car becomes a problem. People surround it, they want it, they need it, and suddenly Ray isn't only trying to protect his family from the aliens, he's trying to protect them from other survivors. I think that sequence is one of the more unsettling moments in the film because nothing supernatural is really required for it to work. You understand exactly why those people are doing what they're doing. That's what makes it nasty. Nobody wakes up that morning planning to attack a family for their vehicle, but civilization is collapsing. There are no clear rules anymore, and one working car might mean the difference between living and dying. Spielberg lets the scene get increasingly uncomfortable until the aliens almost become secondary. For a little while, people are the threat. There's also the imagery of the tripods destroying things that normally feel permanent. Bridges, roads, churches, whole neighborhoods, a ferry. That stuff matters because those are structures people trust. A bridge is supposed to get you somewhere. A church is supposed to feel stable. A road is supposed to connect one place to another. The tripods reduce all of it to temporary scenery. Nothing in the human world looks permanent once they arrive. Even the birds become part of the visual language. The sequence with the birds around the tripod is strange because it changes how you read the machine without giving you a line of explanation. It's just an image, but it matters. Spielberg keeps using small visual details like that rather than stopping the story so somebody can explain what every new development means. And then there's the basement. This is where the movie gets much smaller. No crowds, no collapsing highways, no huge escape route, just a handful of people hiding in an enclosed space while something searches for them. Some viewers hate this section because it slows the movie down. I understand that. You go from huge destruction to characters whispering in a basement, and the shift is pretty dramatic. But as a set piece by itself, there's a lot to like. The tension comes from waiting. Where is the threat? How close is it? Did it hear something? Can Ray keep Rachel quiet? And then you add Tim Robbins to the situation, which means the danger isn't only coming from outside. That gives the whole sequence a different kind of pressure. The big tripod attacks are about running. The basement is about not moving. That contrast is interesting. Spielberg takes away all the open space and forces the characters to stay still while danger moves around them. You're watching people who desperately want to escape but can't. And because Rachel is there, Ray is also constantly thinking about what she might see. That idea comes back during one of the darkest moments in the basement. Ray doesn't just have to survive. He has to make a decision while knowing his daughter is nearby. That changes the emotional weight of the scene. Again, Spielberg doesn't need to show everything. What matters is that Ray understands what has to happen and Rachel doesn't fully see it. That restraint makes the moment more uncomfortable. For all the things War of the Worlds does extremely well, the screenplay has a habit of making you stop and go, wait, what? And that becomes a bigger problem the longer the movie goes on. Early in the film, Spielberg moves everything so quickly that you barely have time to question anything. The lightning starts, the machines come out of the ground, people are running, Ray is trying to get his kids out, the roads are falling apart. You're too busy following the panic to sit there and audit the logic. That's actually important, because once the movie slows down, some of those little questions start getting louder. Why do some vehicles work while others don't? Why is a camera still functioning when electrical equipment has supposedly been knocked out? How are areas not that far away seemingly unaware of the scale of the disaster? And then there's the whole buried machine idea. The tripods have apparently been underground for an absurdly long time, waiting for the aliens to arrive and activate them. Visually, it gives Spielberg one of the best scenes in the movie. As an idea, though, it raises a lot of questions the film never really wants to answer. How long were these things buried there? How did nobody ever discover one? Why plant the machines centuries in advance instead of simply arriving with them? The movie basically says, here's the setup, and hopes the audience will keep running with Ray before thinking too hard about it. For a while that works, then there are smaller things. The heat ray can vaporize people almost instantly, but somehow their clothes are left floating through the air. It's a creepy image, no question, but if the weapon can reduce a human body to dust, why is the clothing untouched? You can explain away almost anything in science fiction if the movie gives you enough momentum or establishes some kind of internal rule. The problem here is that the movie doesn't really explain it. It just looks cool. And honestly, sometimes that's enough, but not always. The alien probe in the basement creates the same issue. These creatures have technology so advanced that humanity's military can barely do anything against them. They've crossed whatever distance separates their world from ours. They have giant war machines. They're wiping out cities, and yet their scouting equipment can be fooled in ways that feel surprisingly basic. Again, during the actual suspense scene, you might not care. The scene is tense. People are hiding. You're waiting for someone to make a sound, but afterward you start thinking about it. And that is probably the biggest structural problem with the second half. the movie gives you time to think. The first hour is almost pure forward momentum. There's always somewhere to go. Something new is happening. A threat appears, Ray reacts, the family moves. The situation gets worse. Then they move again. Once the basement section arrives, the rhythm changes. Now we're staying in one place. The movie becomes quieter. Longer stretches pass without the huge visual events that dominated the first half. Some people really like that change because it turns the movie into claustrophobic suspense. Other people feel the entire thing just stops. And I can see why. The first half feels like you're being dragged through a nightmare. The second half sometimes feels like the nightmare has paused to explain itself. That's dangerous for a movie that works best through panic. Because once the adrenaline drops, the writing has to carry more weight. And this is where some of the dialogue starts feeling thin. There are conversations that don't sound particularly natural. There are emotional beats that feel more functional than convincing. Characters do things because the screenplay needs the story to move in a certain direction, not always because those decisions feel believable in the moment. Robbie is the obvious example. His entire relationship with Ray is built around anger and rebellion, which is fine. That gives them conflict. But eventually his choices become so extreme that the movie starts asking a lot from the audience. You understand that he resents his father. You understand that he wants to see what's happening. You can even understand some kind of emotional impulse to move toward the conflict rather than run away from it. But at a certain point, you're no longer thinking about his psychology. You're thinking about the writer. That's never a good sign. When a character decision makes you aware of the screenplay behind the character, the illusion starts cracking. The garage sequence has a similar problem. Ray needs the car. The world is clearly collapsing. Chaos has already broken out. And yet the behavior around the vehicle doesn't always seem to match what people should already understand about the situation. Again, these are not movie-destroying issues by themselves. Every blockbuster has conveniences. Every disaster movie asks you to accept a few things. The question is how many, and how noticeable they become. The frustrating part is that War of the Worlds earns so much goodwill early on. You want to go with it. The first tripod attack is so strong that you're willing to forgive a lot. The burning train works, the ferry works, the crowds work. The atmosphere works, so when the screenplay starts getting shakier, it feels more disappointing because you know how good the movie can be. And then we get to the ending. This is where a lot of viewers just give up defending the film. The biggest issue is Robbie. The movie spends a lot of time making his situation feel final. Ray is forced to let him go. There's emotional weight in that decision. There's pain. There's the sense that Ray has failed to keep his son with him. Then the ending arrives and Robbie is there, alive, back with the family. And the movie doesn't really give that survival the kind of explanation that would make the moment feel earned. That's a problem. Because if you build an emotional scene around loss, then reverse it later without enough consequence, the earlier scene starts feeling manipulated. You weren't feeling something because the story had earned it. You were feeling something because the movie withheld information from you. Those are not the same thing, and Spielberg already has a reputation, fair or unfair, for leaning into sentiment. So when the family reunion happens, some viewers immediately see it as the director refusing to let the movie end on a genuinely painful note. Ray arrives, the family is there, the emotional circle closes. And suddenly this incredibly brutal story about civilization collapsing ends on something much softer than the rest of the movie seems to be building toward. For some people, that completely breaks the ending. It feels too clean, too convenient, too sentimental, almost like the movie gets nervous about its own darkness. Morgan Freeman's narration doesn't help everyone either. The voiceover explains the larger reason humanity survives, and while that idea comes from the story's basic foundation, the way it's delivered can feel like the film suddenly stepping outside Ray's experience to explain what just happened. After spending so much time keeping us trapped in Ray's limited perspective, the ending becomes much more explanatory. That shift is noticeable. And for viewers who were already feeling that the movie had lost momentum, the finale can feel anticlimactic on top of everything else. The tripods are terrifying for most of the film because they appear unstoppable. Human weapons don't seem to matter. Cities are falling. People are running everywhere. Then the resolution arrives in a way that isn't really connected to Ray doing anything. He survives it. He doesn't solve it. Now, that idea itself is actually faithful to what this kind of story is trying to say. Humanity isn't necessarily powerful enough to win through force. But dramatically, it creates a strange feeling. You've spent nearly 2 hours watching Ray struggle, and the actual end of the invasion happens largely outside his control. That can feel thematically appropriate and emotionally anticlimactic at the same time. Those two things can coexist, and this is where I think the ending is more interesting than just calling it bad. because there is another way to read it. Maybe Spielberg doesn't want the film to end in total despair. Ray has spent the entire movie watching things disappear. Homes, people, roads, safety, normal life. If the film ends with nothing left, then the story becomes almost completely nihilistic. Instead, the ending says that survival is possible. Not victory, exactly. Survival. And survival means rebuilding. It means there is still a family to return to. There is still a future after all this destruction. That doesn't automatically make the reunion believable. It doesn't fix Robbie's return, but it does explain why the movie wants that emotional note. Spielberg seems more interested in recovery than in leaving the audience in total darkness. Some people will accept that, others won't, and I think the difference comes down to how much emotional credibility you're willing to trade for hope, because the final minutes are asking you to accept a lot. The invasion ends. Ray reaches the destination. The family reunites. Robbie is alive. The story explains why humanity survives. And after everything we've just seen, the film suddenly becomes calm. That's a very sharp change, maybe too sharp. The problem isn't that the ending is optimistic. The problem is that it can feel easy. There's a difference. A hopeful ending can still carry damage. It can still make you feel the cost of everything that happened. Here, some of that cost gets softened. And after a movie that was so willing to show bodies in rivers, people fighting over cars, cities being destroyed, and families being torn apart, that softness can feel strange. Almost like two different instincts are fighting inside the film. One wants to make a brutal survival story. The other wants to make sure the audience gets home emotionally intact. And the movie never completely solves that contradiction. That's why the ending remains so controversial. If you respond to the idea of survival and rebuilding, there's something meaningful there. If you're focused on story logic and emotional consequence, it can feel like the movie cheats. And unfortunately, because it comes at the very end, it colors everything that came before it. You start thinking about Robbie. The buried machines, the alien logic, the pacing, the convenient survival, all those little questions that were easy to ignore while Ray was running suddenly come back at once. That's the frustrating thing about War of the Worlds. For long stretches, it's good enough to make you forget its problems. Then it slows down, and the problems catch up. What I keep coming back to with War of the Worlds is how strange its reputation is. People seem to either remember it as one of Spielberg's darker, more effective blockbusters, or as a frustrating movie that starts brilliantly and then slowly talks itself out of being great. And honestly, both reactions make sense. Because this film is full of contradictions. It's enormous, but it stays personal. It's technically polished, but deliberately ugly in places. It's about aliens, but most of the fear comes from human behavior. It's about the end of civilization, yet the story keeps circling back to one father trying to become slightly less terrible at parenting. And even Spielberg's use of aliens feels different here. This is the same filmmaker associated, in the reviews we've been working from, with much gentler ideas of extraterrestrial contact. E.T. gives you an alien who becomes part of a broken family. Close Encounters treats contact as something mysterious, almost spiritual. War of the Worlds has no interest in that. These visitors are not here to teach anyone anything. They're not curious. They're not misunderstood. They arrive with machines that make human civilization look embarrassingly fragile, and they start wiping people out. That change alone gives the movie a very different feeling from Spielberg's earlier alien stories. There's no wonder in the traditional sense. There's awe, sure, but it's the kind of awe you feel while looking at something that could kill you. The tripods are incredible to look at, but nobody in the movie wants to get closer to one. Nobody is searching for communication. Nobody is waiting for some beautiful first contact moment. People see them and run. That feels important because Spielberg still keeps one of his familiar interests intact. The family is broken before the aliens arrive. That part hasn't changed. What changes is what the alien presence does to that family. Instead of healing them through some magical connection, the invasion puts them under pressure until everything unnecessary gets stripped away. Ray doesn't suddenly become a good father because he has a revelation. He becomes a better father because the world stops giving him room to avoid responsibility. That's a much harsher version of the same basic idea. At the beginning, Ray is emotionally distant. He barely seems prepared to have his children for a weekend. Robbie doesn't trust him. Rachel doesn't completely rely on him. There's history there, and none of it is particularly warm. Then normal life disappears. Now there's no time for Ray to slowly work on himself. No therapy, no long conversation, no carefully planned reconciliation. He has to make decisions immediately. Keep moving, find shelter, get food. Protect Rachel, try to hold on to Robbie, and eventually make choices that are much darker than anything the version of Ray we meet at the beginning probably imagined himself capable of. That's where the invasion becomes more than just spectacle. It changes his perspective. Before the tripods appear, Ray's failures feel like personal problems. Afterward, they become almost embarrassingly small compared with what's happening around him. And yet, weirdly, they also become more important. Because once the world is collapsing, being a father is pretty much the only meaningful job he has left. He can't defeat the aliens. He can't organize humanity. He can't even explain what's happening. But he can try to keep his children alive. That's his scale, and the movie never really lets him escape it. I think that's also why the ending is so difficult to separate from the rest of the film. Some people see the ending as Spielberg refusing to commit to the darkness he spent almost 2 hours building, and there's a strong case for that. The movie shows us people being vaporized, bodies floating down a river, crowds turning violent over a vehicle, cities becoming ruins, Ray being forced into situations where survival means doing things he clearly doesn't want to do. Then we arrive at the end and suddenly there's a reunion, there's relief. There's family, there's even a character survival that a lot of viewers find very hard to accept. It can feel like the movie wants all the emotional damage of a brutal apocalypse without fully paying the price at the end. I understand why that annoys people, but I also think the opposite reading is worth considering. Maybe survival is the point, not victory. Survival, those are very different things. Humanity doesn't beat the invaders because we're smarter. Ray doesn't discover some secret weapon. There's no heroic final attack where he saves the planet. He survives long enough to reach the other side of the disaster. That's it. And maybe Spielberg sees that as meaningful enough. The film spends so much time showing how quickly everything can disappear that ending on the possibility of rebuilding becomes almost necessary to its worldview. Otherwise, what's left? Everyone suffers. Civilization collapses. Ray loses his family. The aliens destroy everything. Fade to black. That would certainly be darker, maybe even more consistent with some of the movie's strongest imagery. But would it actually make the film better? I'm not sure. Because War of the Worlds never feels completely nihilistic, even when it gets ugly. There are still people protecting children, still people trying to reach family, still people helping each other. Not everybody becomes a monster. And Ray's entire character arc depends on the idea that catastrophe can reveal something better in a person, as well as something worse. The same disaster that turns a crowd savage also forces Ray to become responsible. That's not a very subtle idea, but it's there, and it explains why the movie refuses to end with nothing. The problem is execution. You can understand what the ending wants to say and still think it gets there too easily. That's the distinction. The idea of rebuilding works. The emotional convenience around it is where people start arguing, and really, that argument describes the whole movie. There are so many places where the underlying idea is strong, but the execution divides people. The family focus is a good idea, unless you hate the family. The basement is a good idea, unless you think it kills the pacing. The restricted perspective is a good idea, unless you want a bigger picture of the invasion. The ending has thematic purpose, unless you feel the movie cheats to achieve it. Even the aliens themselves work better as an idea than they sometimes do when we actually see them. That's why this movie is hard to reduce to good or bad. There are sections of War of the Worlds that are so well made that they almost make the criticism feel petty. The first tripod attack, the burning train, the river, the car mob. The ferry, those scenes have real weight. Then there are moments where you can practically hear the screenplay machinery moving underneath everything. Robbie's decisions, the buried tripods, some of the dialogue, the convenient reunion. That stuff is harder to ignore, and because the highs are so high, the weaknesses feel more frustrating. If this were just an average alien invasion movie, nobody would spend this much time arguing about it. You'd watch it, enjoy a few explosions, and move on. But Spielberg gets close enough to something great that every compromise becomes noticeable. That's probably the real reason the movie still inspires such divided reactions. Some viewers remember how it made them feel. The panic, the siren, the dust, the crowds, that horrible sense that nobody knows what is happening. For them, the film works on a gut level, and the logic problems don't matter much. Other viewers start thinking about the screenplay. Why were the machines underground? Why does Robbie survive? Why does the second half slow down? Why do the aliens become less frightening when we finally see them? And once those questions start piling up, the spell weakens. Neither response is wrong. The movie gives you material for both. Personally, I think its strongest idea is that the invasion reduces humanity to perspective. Ray begins the film thinking his little world is complicated. His ex-wife, his kids, his job, his failures. Then the tripods arrive, and suddenly he understands how small that world really is. But small doesn't mean meaningless. That's the interesting part. His family becomes smaller compared with the scale of the invasion, but more important to him than ever. The whole planet may be under attack, but Ray can only protect the two people standing next to him. That's all the control he gets, and maybe that's why the film feels more unsettling than a lot of bigger alien movies. Nobody becomes powerful, nobody earns control, people adapt, they panic, they hurt each other, they protect each other. They survive if they're lucky. That's not exactly uplifting, but it isn't hopeless either. And that middle ground is where War of the Worlds seems to live. It's too dark to be a comfortable Spielberg adventure, too sentimental in places to be a completely ruthless survival film, too intimate to become a full-scale war movie, too spectacular to feel like a small family drama. It keeps pulling in opposite directions. Sometimes that tension makes it better. Sometimes it nearly breaks the movie, but it does make it memorable. And maybe that's the best way to look at Spielberg's War of the Worlds, not as a perfect science fiction film, not as a failed one either, more like a movie that gets frighteningly close to greatness, stumbles over some of its own choices, and somehow remains interesting because you can still feel both versions of it fighting for control. The masterpiece it almost became, and the messy, visceral blockbuster we actually got.